It's strange to be with you like this from my home, and I'd much rather be with you in person, but it's great to be joining you at all. My name's Niv, and I'm based in Oxford at the moment. We're thinking about life and the Bible. Can we take it seriously? Is it worth changing our minds, even our lives, to follow it? I used to be an atheist, and the thought of doing that would have felt crazy to me back then. At the time, Professor Richard Dawkins would have spoken for me when he said these words. I'm quoting him. To be fair, much of the Bible is not systematically evil, but just plain weird, as you would expect of a chaotically cobbled together anthology of disjointed documents, composed, revised, translated, distorted, and improved by hundreds of anonymous authors. So he says. And there are two big issues that come out of what he puts out. First, immoral, so that when we read the Bible, we find it jarring with some of our deeply held values. And second, untrustworthy, not intellectually credible, because it's such a mess. If you're looking for meaning, for answers, Richard Dawkins and countless others would say, don't bother with the Bible. So can we trust it? That's a huge question about a huge book. But we have to start somewhere. And a key place to start is with what the Bible really is. It's really a story. Not a fictional story, but a true one. An unfolding historical narrative. It's a collection of 66 books, written over many centuries by a range of different authors. It comes to us from a variety of languages and cultures, and it features a beautiful diversity of genres and different kinds of literature. And it has an overarching storyline, a message about the God who made this world, and made us, and loves us, who, when it all went wrong, with us and with our world, didn't abandon us, but in his love promised a way back home. And at the climax of the Bible story, the climax of history, came in person himself to make that happen. And unless we understand that that's what the Bible really is, we'll never see if we can trust it or not. If we treat it like a rule book, we'll be disappointed by all the things we aren't finding there. If we treat it like a science textbook, ignoring its different genres and how it communicates, we'd miss out. So the real question is, can we trust this story that the Bible is telling? Is its record of a God come in person to fix our broken world worth taking seriously? Here's one reason why we should. Far from being an immoral book, the Bible has been foundational to our highest moral ideals. Think, if you're a Hamilton fan, the musical Hamilton, of the statement of the US Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Really wonderful words. Responding to that, the novelist Marilynne Robinson made this observation in one of her essays. She says, Jefferson has used scripture, the Bible, to assert a particular form of human exceptionalism, one that anchors our nature, that is to say our dignity, in a reality outside the world of circumstance. She asks, what would a secular paraphrase of this even look like? In what non-religious terms is human equality self-evident? We need the reality of the world outside our circumstance. We need a bigger story in order to say that all human beings are created equal. And the Bible, with its unique view of human dignity, has been where our understanding of justice and equality has come from. It has powered abolition movements, the pursuit of justice for women, for the poor, and so much more. Now, obviously, there's a lot more we could say about that, but we can't overestimate the impact of the Bible on our values and what we hold dear. What about whether the Bible is untrustworthy, an inaccurate mess? Well, I first read the Bible seriously as an atheist, and my first surprise was that when I opened it, I was being pointed to history. That to answer my big questions about life, I didn't need blind faith. I needed to investigate Jesus of Nazareth, the things he said and did in real history in the first century. I want us to major on that historical claim as a way of thinking about the Bible and whether we can trust it. And so let's focus on that part of the Bible that talks most about him, the New Testament. Now, as a Christian, I definitely believe that the Bible is more than a human-authored book. But whatever you believe, it's certainly not less than that. And so it's right to assess these writings as history. Are they early enough? Are they coherent enough to trust on that basis? Now, it's easy to get the impression that they aren't. Sometimes people say that it took centuries for the Bible to come together. And it's true that our earliest complete Bible only dates from AD 330. You might think 300 years after the events it describes. After 300 years, can you really take what it says about the past seriously? But there's a problem with putting it that way. It's true that our first full text of the complete Bible dates to the 4th century. But we have found plenty of fragments of manuscripts and papyrus and so on from before then making up the Bible. In the past 150 years or so, a whole academic discipline has emerged of manuscript criticism. As archaeological findings have been unearthed, decades of research from all kinds of scholars, both with and without religious conviction, have been spent on testing the historical claims of the Bible. And as a result, we simply have to abandon the idea that these writings about Jesus are late fabrications. Our earliest physical fragment of the New Testament is called Papyrus 52, and you can find it in the Rylands Library in Manchester. It's from John's Gospel, and paleographical study, that's the study of handwriting and script, dates it to around AD 125, which would only be 3 or 4 decades after John's Gospel was written. In fact, when we look at the New Testament, we have an embarrassment of riches. When we investigate the ancient world, a key part of the evidence we're working with is manuscripts. They're hard to find because they very rarely survived. And so with most ancient texts, you find 2 things. First, there's a huge gap between the text being written down and our first physical copies of it, or fragments of it, sometimes a gap of centuries. Second, there's a very small number of manuscripts and copies for us to examine. So if things did get changed around, we wouldn't be able to tell. That doesn't trouble most historians of the ancient world. They understand the nature of the evidence left to us. But with the New Testament, we're in a totally different position. The gap between the text being written and our first copy is tiny, as little as 35 years with John's Gospel. And the number of copies we have is massive, so that we can probe the text with many sources at our disposal. And in fact, because we have all these copies, we can be very confident that what we have is what they wrote. And even the most critical scholarly voices admit that in all the manuscript criticism we've done so far, not one claim about Jesus has had to be altered. Scholars date the 4 Gospels themselves to within 40 or 50 years of the events they describe, which would be well within living memory. Even earlier are the letters written by Paul, and the first one is dated to around 48 AD. That's just 15 years or so after Jesus' death. His letters showed that as early as that, Christians believed in a divine Jesus who had died and risen again. The New Testament documents are the earliest sources we have about Jesus. No serious historian can dismiss them. We have what was written. But is what was written worth taking seriously? Well, here's the next thing I found as I investigated these texts. The writers claim to report what people saw, heard, and experienced. So, for example, when he's writing about Jesus' death, John writes, "The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true." And at the end of his account of Jesus' life, you can read it in chapter 20, he wrote this: "Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." In other words, John claims to have been reporting eyewitness testimony. What he wrote, what others wrote in the Bible, is what people saw, heard, and experienced. So the writers of the New Testament claim to be writing history as best they can. They litter their writings with names of places, of people, with all kinds of details. It's a big claim that they're writing history, but it's one that you can test. And archaeological findings are one way of testing these texts. For example, in John's Gospel chapter 5, Jesus goes to a pool in Bethesda to heal a lame man. And up until the 19th century, people dismissed that. They said there was no proof of any pool like that in the Sheep Gate area of Jerusalem. Until, that is, some archaeologists discovered it in the 30s. And that's one example among many. There are lots of other details too. Corroboration from non-biblical ancient sources. Details like personal names being used. Now we need to explain this somehow. If the New Testament writers aren't telling the truth, how do they keep getting it right? How do they give us little details and touches that only eyewitnesses could have had, unless that's what they were? But we might think, okay, even if these are eyewitnesses, aren't all these writers Christians? Why should I trust them? Won't they be biased? Well, we do have non-Christian sources referring to Jesus. People like Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny, Lucian of Samosata, they make reference to him. And astonishingly, a common theme in their work is that Jesus performed miracles. Although, of course, it's written off as sorcery, because they're his opponents. But all those sources about Jesus come much later than the writings we have in the New Testament. And actually, the fact that Christian writers were biased is actually really valuable to us. Everyone is biased, aren't they? That's how history works. Early Christians wrote with an agenda as much as their opponents did. There's no such thing as neutral history. But what we normally find is that history is written by the winners. People with the power, the ones on the right side of history, are able to present things from their perspective. But when you read the earliest Christian writings, you're reading history written by the losers. This message was deeply unpopular. The Jewish nation in which Christianity was born was utterly hostile to this upstart Messiah cult. The Roman Empire in which it grew became more and more violent in its suppression of this movement. What you have when you read these writings is the testimony of people who have nothing to gain by writing what they write, and in fact stood to lose their lives, as many did, for standing by what they said. This is history written by the losers. And in fact, Paul, who I mentioned earlier, begins as a persecutor of the Christians, one who doesn't believe in any of it, and has one of the most dramatic reversals in history as he becomes their most articulate and accomplished spokesman, because he claims to have encountered Jesus alive again. These writings are full of details you wouldn't include if you were trying to start a movement. For example, Jesus' followers don't look like wise, heroic figures. They often look inept, slow on the uptake. Why portray yourself that way if you were making it all up? And in fact, why make any of it up, given that it cost them so much to stand by these claims? That's what Brandon was asking so helpfully. We're horrified when politicians have abused their power and privilege to assert falsehood. We're right to question those in authority and to be sceptical about their agendas. But we need to see that the early Christians had none of the power, none of the influence, and none of the vested interests. They were a despised minority, with no power or privilege from which to proclaim their message. But something about Jesus means that they did. And they kept going even though it cost them, even though they were persecuted. Somehow we've got to make sense of Jesus. Nobody's impact on history compares to his. We even measure history around his life. That's what BC and AD means. And here's all he had to work with. Here were Jesus' raw ingredients. He only had 3 years in the public eye. He had 12 haphazard and incompetent followers, one of whom betrayed him. He didn't live in a big influential city or go to university, but had the backwater of the Galilean countryside, Nowheresville in the Roman Empire. He had no money to spend, no armies to fight for him, and the climax of it all? A public, shameful execution. That's all Jesus had to work with. And with just that, Jesus began a movement that is growing at a staggering rate to this day. 2 billion people, and counting, seriously call this homeless carpenter God. How do you explain it? The New Testament writings, viewed simply as history, come up with the goods in offering us an account of Jesus' life, and they present him as an individual of world-changing significance. And by reading what they wrote, perhaps by taking away one of these Gospels of John, finding one to read, you can discover what the truth about Jesus is for yourself. That's what we're inviting you to investigate this week. When we open up the Bible, we're sharing solid historical evidence. And when we look at these writings about Jesus, we see that they can be trusted as history. But that's really just the beginning. Jesus comes to offer real love, real hope, real security to people in a dark, cynical, fragile, locked-down world. And Jesus claimed, and his early followers claimed, that his death and resurrection were what made that possible. Maybe that sounds ridiculous to you today. Would have sounded even more ridiculous back then. And yet, this man's claim took hold of history, turned the Roman Empire around completely, changed the world, and is changing people today. There's no story like it. And if it were true, wouldn't it make a difference? For us, for you and for me. I wonder if you've ever read the novel Life of Pi, or maybe watched the film. If you have, you'll know that Pi tells two very different stories in it. One short, brutal and ugly, and presumably true. One beautiful and exciting, and a real stretch to believe. At the end, he asks his audience which story they prefer. They have to choose one, the true story or the good story. But when we look at the Bible, we find that they're the same one. We find a story that does meet our desire for truth, but also one that meets our desires for more than that, for real love, real meaning, real hope. As I finish, let me ask, what if you didn't have to choose? What if the true story of everything is also the most beautiful story of all? What if at the centre of history is a person offering something more wonderful than we can imagine, and you can have it? I and many millions more have found that the Bible offers both. In Jesus we find both the true story about reality and the most beautiful story about reality. The one that makes sense of us, our understanding and our desires. We would love you to see for yourself. At the very least, as thinking people, we would love you to take up the evidence and see where it's pointing. Get your hands on one of these or check it out on the internet. Take up the evidence and see where it's pointing. Not to be content with fuzzy thinking or alternative facts, but to weigh it all up and make up your own mind. So let me challenge you to investigate Jesus.